Horton. On behalf of historic Cabarrus and Cabarrus County, welcome to another historical moment in the story of old Cabarrus County. We're beginning a series of videos on the heritage and the history of those German-speaking people who first settled in the northeastern corner of what became Mecklenburg County and later was called Cabarrus County, and in the southeastern corner of old Rowan County. We're particularly interested in the story of their churches, the Lutheran and German Reformed churches which they organized, and the schools that the good people of those congregations built. Then we're going to do a segment on the Hessian soldiers who came to fight in the Revolutionary War on the side of the British, but many of whom stayed and helped people the German-speaking sections of Cabarrus and Rowan counties. We're particularly interested in the story of John Reed, one of those Hessian soldiers who was actually present at the beginning of what we now call the Carolina Gold Rush. Then we're going to talk about Old Mount Pleasant, her stately and beautiful homes, her famous citizens, and of course, the famous Eastern Cabarrus Historical Museum. They were German-speaking people. They were driven from their ancestral homes in Germany and Switzerland by the devastation of war, by religious intolerance, and by persecution. They were attracted to the broad, rolling lands of the New World with the promise of a new life for themselves and their generations. During the latter years of the 17th and early years of the 18th century, many of the German people landed at ports in Pennsylvania, drawn there by the promise of the greatest farmlands on earth and by William Penn's promise of good government and of religious tolerance for all. Many landed at nearby Baltimore, Maryland, while others of their countrymen sailed to Savannah, Georgia, moved up the Savannah River and formed German colonies there. Finally, still others of their countrymen landed at Charleston, South Carolina, moved inland in South Carolina, and formed the German colony at Orangeburg. Those early settlements in Pennsylvania prospered, and as the German families grew, as did those of their Irish Presbyterian neighbors, they began to search for new farmlands and more affordable farmlands. They moved to the west across Pennsylvania until they reached the barrier of the Allegheny Mountains. There they looked south through the Valley of Virginia, searching for land that was more readily available and less expensive. They moved south, both Germans and Irish Presbyterians, sometimes preceding, sometimes following the other. And for a season they stopped in Virginia, established homes, and then moved on to the backcountry of North Carolina, into an area that became Cabarrus and Rowan counties in that state. They also were religious people. They were faith-based people. And as they traveled, they brought with them their hymn books and their catechisms, books of sermons. After they had built a rough house in which to live for the winter and prepared the land for their first crop, they began to meet together in congregations at someone's home. And there they worshiped, although they didn't have the benefit of ministers at that time. Some of the elders in the congregation would read passages from books of sermons, and the people would meet and pray together and gather strength for their journey. The Presbyterians came first to the area that became Cabarrus County in the 1730s. They were followed closely by the German settlers within the next decade. The Irish Presbyterians tended to occupy the lands in the western part of Cabarrus County in what we now call the Rocky River Valley, while the Germans occupied the area to their east. While the lands in eastern Cabarrus were not really as rich, they were ideal for small grain, and the thrifty German farmers prospered there. They tended to settle and live in small, close-knit communities where they could share a common language and also continue to observe their own customs and traditions. They were not only farmers, they were great workers in wood and stone. They were builders, artisans. They were great husbandmen, raisers of animals and spinners of cloth, and workers in wood of all sorts. They built buildings which still endure in the county and even crafted their own musical instruments on some occasions. In 1755, North Carolina Governor Arthur Dobbs visited the area of present-day Cabarrus County to view his extensive land holdings. He wrote the London Board of Trade that he found at least 22 German and Swiss families occupying his lands at that time. He commented they were very industrious people, and he also noted the large families that the settlers had. We know from other sources that these people were people who loved hearth and home, but they were ready to fight for their new land. They loved their liberty. Oftentimes there's a misconception that our local Germans didn't participate in the American Revolution because King George III of England was a German Lutheran of the House of Hanover, and also because the Moravians in the Winston-Salem area did not participate in the war because of religious reasons. Our Germans, however, loved their new liberty, and they were ready to fight to defend it. They marched to war beside their Irish Presbyterian neighbors. In fact, many of them served as militia captains during the Revolution. The success of those early settlements soon attracted colonists from other areas. They gave us some of our best-known German families. By 1771, John Michael Weinkauf and Thomas Mock and their respective families made the long journey from the Savannah River in Georgia through South Carolina and into the back country of North Carolina, where they settled in the area which became present-day Cabarrus County. John Michael Weinkauf is the ancestor of the large Weinkauf family of Cabarrus and Rowan counties, which has branches throughout the United States. It was not easy for our early officials to understand the thick accents of those German settlers. So the word for German, or Deutsch, soon became anglicized as Dutch. And until fairly recent days, the eastern portion of Cabarrus County was referred to as the Dutch side of the county. In like manner, our German settlers in Pennsylvania were referred to, and still are, as the Pennsylvania Dutch, although they were not generally from Holland. We also named our creeks and streams in that same manner. The Germans named one of their major streams Dutch Buffalo Creek, just as the Irish Presbyterians had named English or Irish Buffalo Creek in the western portion of the county. One of the oldest roads in the eastern part of Cabarrus County, which still is shown on county maps, is of course Dutch Road. The Germans were also great cooks and bakers. One of their outdoor bake ovens is still preserved today and can be seen at Old Lower Stone Church in southern Rowan County. We still cook today in a much smaller version of that oven, which we call, appropriately enough, a Dutch oven. Some of our early settlers retained the German spelling and pronunciation of their names, while others accepted the English translation. Thus, Zimmerman became carpenter. Schneider was translated as tailor, and Schwarzwalder became the well-known black welder family. Curiously, the German name Klein is found in English as Klein and Klein with a K, as well as small, little, and short. Some of those early German families played prominent roles in local civic and political affairs. The family of Martin Pfeiffer contributed to the family not only as large landowners and innkeepers and farmers, but served in the state legislature and began the movement toward setting Cabarrus off as a separate county from Mecklenburg County. The rest of the family served during the American Revolution honorably and well, as Martin Pfeiffer himself had done during the Indian Wars. They met President George Washington, with the result that when Washington traveled south on his tour of the southern states in 1791, he stopped for the night at the Red Hill Tavern, the local inn and popular dwelling place of the Pfeiffer family here in Cabarrus County. John Paul Barringer was another well-known German immigrant, known as Pioneer Paul to his descendants. He settled a few miles from the present location of Mount Pleasant, where he built his home. In 1768, Pioneer Paul entertained Governor William Tryon when he visited this area of the state. Later, Mr. Barringer's children and grandchildren became generals of the Army, lawyers, judges, congressmen, and other well-known doctors and politicians alike. One of his best-known descendants, his grandson Rufus Barringer, was a lawyer who also served in the state legislature. Rufus was largely responsible for the North Carolina Railroad passing by Concord so closely and making that small courthouse community into a thriving city of the New South a few years later. Mr. Barringer was imprisoned during the war between the states, and while imprisoned, met President Abraham Lincoln. Although the Presbyterians arrived first in the area which became Cabarrus County, German colonists claimed the oldest dates for their churches in eastern Cabarrus and southern Rowan counties. Old St. John's Lutheran Church in the eastern portion of Cabarrus County dates its organization to 1745, about the time that Germans first arrived in this area. In those days, the churches were generally union churches. That is, the German Reformed and Lutheran members worshiped together. After all, they were only divided by some doctrinal differences, but they shared a common language and they shared a common Reformation faith. St. John's Lutheran Church is now located just off Highway 73 between Concord and Mount Pleasant. Old St. John's dates its beginnings to the Dutch Buffalo Meeting House, a log church which was erected several miles north of Mount Pleasant on a tract of land overlooking its namesake creek. Many years later, a monument was erected on that site to mark the location of the original meeting house. Appropriately enough, it was dedicated on Thanksgiving Day in 1894. In the latter 1760s, the members of Dutch Buffalo Meeting House decided to erect a new log church. The location of that church was about 1/2 mile east of the present location of St. John's Lutheran. They continued to worship there together for a few years and then amicably divided in 1771. The Lutheran members of Dutch Buffalo moved to the present location of St. John's Lutheran and built their third meeting house in the midst of what is now the extensive St. John's Cemetery. That meeting house was made possible due to the financial help of one of the leading members of the St. John's congregation, Captain John Paul Barringer, who is buried in that cemetery. As we noted earlier, Captain Barringer was the father of a distinguished group of children and grandchildren who have participated in every phase of life in Cabarrus County. He was so well regarded by the St. John's congregation that the members built a special enclosed pew for Captain Barringer and his family. The St. John's congregation began construction of their fourth church building in 1784 and completed the construction and dedicated the building on Independence Day, 1785. The building's red color gave rise to its common name of Old Red Meeting House. Although that building has been lost to time, in 1976, members of St. John's History Committee and other interested persons were able to locate some of the original timbers used in the construction of the old red meeting house. Using those timbers, they completed a replica which they dedicated in 1976 on a smaller scale of that old meeting house. The pews and pulpits in the interior give us some indication of worship in those days. The St. John's congregation had always strongly supported the education of its young people, and the congregation built a separate schoolhouse nearly adjacent to the old red meeting house. The congregation hired George Friesland, a native of Hanover in Germany, as the new schoolmaster. He replaced Martin Ludwig in that position. He taught school in a two-room schoolhouse, one room of which was dedicated to the education of the students, the other room of which was reserved for the schoolmaster and his family's living quarters. The present lovely brick sanctuary of St. John's Lutheran Church was erected in 1845. It was about 55 feet by 80 feet in length. The doors at that time were located on the eastern side of the church. As was appropriate for that age, the church also possessed a slave gallery. That church has been remodeled a number of times since then, beginning in 1888, and still serves the present needs of the congregation. During the remodeling process, the doors were moved to the western end of the building, from which access is gained now. In later years, Sunday school rooms and an educational building were added to the plant. Even as the St. John's congregation was growing and meeting the needs of German-speaking settlers in Cabarrus County, its sister Lutheran congregations were ministering to German-speaking people in southeastern Rowan County. In 1745, according to traditional church histories, historic Oregon Lutheran Church was organized as a part of what was then called the Old Hickory Church. Old Hickory was a Reformed church and was named after the logs that were used in its construction. In about 7 years after its formation, the Lutheran and German Reformed members of Old Hickory came to an amicable parting of the ways, and the Lutheran members of the congregation moved to the present site of Oregon Lutheran Church. They began construction some years later on a beautiful rock church, the construction of which was interrupted by the Revolutionary War and the needs for materials to be used in that struggle, delayed the completion of the church until sometime between 1792 and 1795. When the congregation moved in their new beautiful rock sanctuary, they also moved into the sanctuary the organ, which was constructed by a member of the congregation named John Steyerwalt, a German artisan who built the organ out of native materials. His brother Jacob Steyerwalt was also a craftsman who built the beautiful home called Mill Hill in Cabarrus County in about 1812. Jacob Steyerwalt also built its own organ for Mill Hill. Even after a quarter century of settlement, German-speaking people who lived in Cabarrus and Rowan counties still had no resident pastor among them. They also had had difficulty attracting a qualified school teacher for their children. In 1771, about 60 families who were members of the Lutheran congregations in Cabarrus and Rowan counties agreed to send 2 members from their churches to make a plea for a pastor and for a school teacher for their congregations. So in 1771, Christopher Rentleman and Christopher Lyerly agreed to travel at their own expense to England to try to fill the need for a minister and a school teacher. They traveled by horseback to Charleston, South Carolina, sold their horses, and booked passage for London. While they were in England, they found great support for their cause, and they managed to recruit both a school teacher and a minister. In addition, they received offerings which totaled $800, a considerable sum for that day. They were given hymn books and catechisms, books of worship to bring back with them for use of the local churches. They also received a treasured baptismal and communion set, both of which are still on display at historic Oregon Church. By tradition, Christopher Wendelman was a member of the Oregon congregation, and Christopher Lyerly was a member of St. John's, although he may have been a member of the congregation at St. John's in Salisbury or at the Oregon Church himself. When they returned, they were followed soon after by Adolf Nussmann, a German minister who was highly qualified, who had agreed to devote the remainder of his life to serving the congregations in the New World. Nussmann and a school teacher named Gottfried Arntz, or Arndt, arrived in the New World in 1773 and made their way to Cabarrus and Rowan counties. Nussmann preached in the churches at Oregon and at St. John's in Salisbury for about a year. Then he moved to the vicinity of St. John's Lutheran in Cabarrus County, where he ministered to the people for the rest of his life. A monument in his honor is erected at St. John's Church as well as at Oregon Church. The school teacher, Mr. Arntz, or Arndt, taught school for several years and then entered the ministry himself to help fill the need for more resident pastors. He ministered to the congregations in St. John's in Salisbury and to the congregation at Oregon for many years. His service to that congregation is also honored with a fitting memorial. The outbreak of the Revolutionary War slowed the growth of Lutheranism in North Carolina. Both Reverend Nussmann and Reverend Ahrens were patriots, and for that reason were harassed by Tories in the area. After the end of the war, a great ally was sent to them when German Lutherans sent Reverend C.A.G. Storch to live and preach in the area. Reverend Storch preached to the congregations in Cabarrus and Rowan counties most of his life and became the acknowledged leader of Lutheranism in North Carolina. Another pre-revolutionary German congregation formed near Coldwater Creek in Cabarrus County. In 1768, we find a man preaching there who was eventually to bring unity and cohesion to the Reformed churches of North Carolina. Samuel Souther was born in Switzerland in 1722. He traveled by boat to the New World with his father and 11 or 12 siblings. During a terrific storm at sea, all of his family was lost except for Souther. He was highly educated in the German language, of course, and we find him teaching in Pennsylvania before he moved to Orangeburg, South Carolina. There he married and was living with his family in 1760. The record goes silent for some years about Reverend Souther until in 1768 we find him preaching for Governor William Trine on the governor's visit to the far western parts of North Carolina. Reverend Souther was intensely patriotic and led his congregations to the cause of independence during the Revolutionary conflict. Because of his preaching and teaching, he was targeted by the Tories, who camped on his lands in Guilford County and burned much of his farm. Although Reverend Souther died and is buried in Orangeburg, South Carolina, two of his sons, John and David, continued to live in Cabarrus County, where their descendants still live to this day. The old Coldwater Church continued to struggle after the Revolutionary War, finding it difficult to attract a full-time pastor. In 1814, the church was admitted to the Lutheran Synod of North Carolina. In 1843, during the pastorate of Reverend W.G. Harder, the Lutheran members of the church removed to nearby Concord, where they formed St. James Lutheran Church. Later on, the Reformed members of Coldwater moved to the old Concord Salisbury Road, where they built New Gilead Church in about 1854. In 1871, the remaining members of Coldwater reorganized as an entirely Lutheran church. The final great 18th century Lutheran Church was added to the rolls of Cabarrus County in 1797 when St. Martin's Lutheran Church was organized. By 1800, there were 27 Lutheran churches in North Carolina, most of them grouped in the Piedmont. In 1803, the Lutheran Synod of North Carolina was organized. Meanwhile, their Reformed cousins were building churches and schoolhouses, educating their children, ministering to their flocks. It is their story we'll tell in our next segment as we tell a little of the history of the Reformed people in Cabarrus and Rowan counties. We're glad you could be with us as we begin to turn the yellowed pages which tell the story of the Dutch side of this special place, this Cabarrus. We hope to see you again real soon.